Okay, right. This is just a short video. It's designed for theme 2, the section on unemployment. And what I'm going to try and do here is explain the difference between the Keynesian view on the causes of unemployment and the classical school view. So, if we take the Keynesian school view first, as most of you probably realise, as far as the Keynesian is concerned, the cause of unemployment is a lack of aggregate demand in the economy. Keynesians believe that the level of aggregate demand determines the level of output and employment. So you might have an economy in equilibrium at NY1 because the level of aggregate demand is stable at AD1. I've also drawn on an employment line which basically shows the level of employment that corresponds to every single possible level of GDP. So if the level of aggregate demand falls, maybe people start saving more. If you're a Keynesian, you don't like people saving. What's going to happen is that the level of aggregate demand is going to drop. The curve shifts to the left, it shifts inwards from AD1 to AD2. What that then causes is a fall in the level of output. Firms will respond to the fall in aggregate demand by reducing production so that they don't build up unsold stock. And if firms are producing less output, they won't need as many factors of production, including labour. So firms will start shedding employees, and the result of that is that the level of employment drops. So that's how you can get unemployment developing, according to a Keynesian. Something's happened in the economy, maybe interest rates have gone up, maybe there's been an external shock to the economy, maybe some banks have gone bust, or as I say, maybe people have done this hideous thing called saving. And from a Keynesian perspective, that results in a decrease in the derived demand for labour because the economy will shrink in response to that fall in aggregate demand. And you get a recession and the accompanying rise in unemployment that you typically see. So that's the Keynesian view. Done pretty quickly, if I might say so. The classical school view is completely different. They believe that the level of employment in the economy is just a function of supply and demand forces in the labour market. So households supply labour. They do that because most people are working class and they have to earn a wage in order to generate the income needed to live. Firms demand labour. Generally speaking, firms will demand more labour when the wage rate falls because it becomes cheaper to hire people rather than using capital. So the classical school view is that the labour market will come into equilibrium at general equilibrium, where the supply of labour equals the demand for labour. The labour market will clear, it will naturally come into equilibrium, and you call the equilibrium level of employment the natural rate of employment. So that's a central idea in classical economics, the idea of the labour market clearing and the equilibrium level of employment being called the natural rate of employment. If we actually look at the total size of the working population, we could have E1 to E2 people who are what a classical economist would say is they're voluntarily unemployed. There might be E2 people, technically speaking, of working age, but those not all of those people are in work. Only E1 are in work. E1 to E2 will only work if the wage is currently higher than W1. So let's dig in a little bit further to possible causes of unemployment from a classical perspective. So the classical school, they believe that there are two types of unemployment. The first type of unemployment is called involuntary unemployment, and the involuntarily unemployed are unemployed because they can't find a job at the going wage rate. So the first thing that could go wrong, that could create that situation, is an imperfection in the labour market. And imperfections in the labour market stop the labour market from reaching a market clearing equilibrium. So let's have some examples of some of these market imperfections in the labour market. The most obvious one is a minimum wage. Let's imagine, if you see the top diagram there, that the government imposed a minimum wage that was above the market clearing wage of W1. Just to check there. So in my diagram, sorry, I'll change that. On that top diagram there, the equilibrium wage rate is WE. The government imposes a minimum wage of W1. What that then does is cause a disequilibrium in the labour market. By law, firms are not allowed to pay people less than the minimum. So what happens is that the demand for labour contracts and the supply of labour extends, and what you get is a permanent excess supply in the labour market. And that excess supply in the labour market is unemployment. The demand for labour is only E1, but there's E2 people who want to work at the minimum wage. So if you think about that, if you want to get rid of involuntary unemployment, you need to get rid of the labour market imperfections that are preventing the labour market from clearing. So a classical school view on reducing unemployment, well, the first thing you've got to do is remove any labour market imperfections, get rid of minimum wages. Most classical economists, they'd also look at trade unions, and they would say that trade unions can use the threat of strike action to force the wage rate permanently above the market equilibrium wage. And in doing so, they're pricing their own members, their own workers, out of their own jobs. So not a smart idea. So maybe the government could try to pass laws to weaken trade union power. For example, they could make it harder for trade unions to call strikes. So that's one solution then to unemployment if you're a classical economist. Take away the labour market imperfections and allow the labour market to clear. If the wage rate falls back from W1 to the equilibrium of WE, then there'll be an increase in employment from E1 to EE. And that will be a great way of eliminating involuntary unemployment. So that's another thing that you could basically write in an answer, is that from a classical perspective, if the labour market is clearing, there'll be zero involuntary unemployment. Everybody who's prepared to work at the equilibrium wage of WE can get a job, provided that we've got rid of these labour market imperfections. So let's move on and think about the second type of unemployment from a classical perspective. The second type is called voluntary unemployment. So these are people who are unemployed because they're not willing to work at the current wage rate. So you could basically call this the L'Oreal factor, because I'm worth it. I value my leisure time very highly. Maybe I've got some nice welfare benefits to live off. And at the current equilibrium wage, I'm not up for it. I'm not prepared to sell my labour. I'm valuing my own leisure time very highly, and I'm not prepared to seek work at the equilibrium wage. So the middle diagram would show that outcome. So the labour market's clearing, but there are some people, I've labelled it as E2, who are not prepared to work at that wage rate. They would want a higher wage rate than W1 to persuade them to work. So how do you get rid of voluntary unemployment? Well, the obvious thing that you can do is to try to increase the supply of labour curve from S1 to S2, and if you can do that, you'll increase the natural rate of employment, and by doing so you'll reduce voluntary unemployment. There'll be fewer people of working age who aren't working. So what could you actually do to increase the supply of labour? One thing that you could do, as I say, is just tax and benefit reform. Try to make work pay. So in the UK, probably the best thing that you could write about is maybe reducing tax credits that incentivise people to work part-time rather than full-time. And maybe increase the personal tax allowance, which is the amount of money that you can earn before you start paying income tax. So in summary, if we try to recap what we've just said, Keynesians, they tend to focus very much on a lack of aggregate demand as the cause of unemployment. They'd also buy into structural, seasonal unemployment and frictional unemployment too. Those classical economists would recognise those as well. But first and foremost, they're obsessed with this idea of unemployment being caused by a lack of aggregate demand in the economy. So the solution is just to use demand side policies to pump the level of aggregate demand back up again. So by running fiscal deficits or loosening monetary policy. Classical economists, they don't think that that's going to work. If you pump in extra aggregate demand, from their perspective, what's going to happen is that you just get inflation. They believe that the long run aggregate supply curve is perfectly price elastic at the general equilibrium output level. So I'll just draw the diagram there. So looking at the bottom diagram, what you can see is that the aggregate demand increase just causes inflation of AP1 to AP2. No increase in GDP, so therefore no increase in employment. So again, like the classical school view is, to tackle involuntary unemployment, we need to get the labour market clearing. We need to remove any excess supply of labour in the labour market, get rid of minimum wages, reduce the power of unions. To tackle voluntary unemployment, we actually need to increase the natural rate of employment. And to do that, we need to shift the supply of labour to the right, and that will increase the natural rate of employment. Okay, hopefully that's been clear. See you another time when I do another video. Bye.